Okay, so when we think about peace accords and peace deals, we often think about leaders coming together, a big fancy signing, the press is there, maybe there's a band. But what often happens, what's most critical to advance international peace over the decades have been driven by citizens, behind the scenes, not in front of the press, that's what's really helping to bring about more peace in the world. So today we're going to talk about what motivates them to act, what strategies are most effective, and how we can help them be more effective. Today's speaker today is Cecily Brewer. She's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and was recently a senior expert with the United States Institute for Peace, where she focused on international negotiations and peace processes. Previously, she was a career civil servant with the U.S. State Department, working across 4 presidential administrations to shape strategic planning, African policy, and the U.S. approach to more than a dozen international conflicts. She served on the Vice President's Foreign Policy Advisor for Africa and as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Team. She was an advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy and was part of the U.S. mediation team in the Sudan-South Sudan negotiations. She's earned her master's from Johns Hopkins University in Advanced International Studies and holds a bachelor's from Amherst College, and she's from West Lafayette, Indiana. So please join me in welcoming Cecily Brewer today.
Thank you. It is great to be with you all here today. As Scott said, I'm from West Lafayette, where Purdue University is, and so it's really fun to be back on a university campus, particularly in the fall. The energy and the beauty is lovely to be part of. So I'm excited to be here today to talk and contribute to your theme this semester of the future of citizenship. And I wanted to talk with you today about a topic that I've been thinking a lot about, and that's citizens working for peace. As Scott said, often when we think about peace, if I talk about peace processes or peace talks, I'm guessing an image like this is what pops into your mind, right? Leaders in front of a camera, shaking hands, and a deal signed. But actually, my first experience in peacemaking looked a lot more like this. And it was sitting around a tree. I was in the background. It was communities themselves talking to each other for hours, sometimes days. It was definitely inspirational, but also requiring of some patience. But this, as Scott said, is often where some of the hard work of finding common ground and making decisions for the sake of the communities themselves comes from. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about kind of how these two formal, on the one hand, state-led formal processes, and on the other hand, informal, citizen-led processes, and how they come together. I, in my career, have worked on both, and so while I spent the majority of my career on the formal side, I've really enjoyed the past year or so looking at the interplay between the two. So let's get right into it. Going back to this photo, some of you might have guessed by now that this is a photo taken in Washington, D.C. in 1993 of the signing of the Oslo Accords. It was a very important moment between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They set forth a declaration of principles. But behind this photo was actually years of secret negotiations that happened not in Washington, D.C., but actually in Norway. And not at the beginning by government officials per se. It was a Norwegian sociologist who kind of created the energy for the talks supported by the Norwegian government at the time, but not held in an official government office, but instead in a Norwegian government official's home. So they were informal talks. In fact, the Israelis did not even send a government delegation to the beginning of the talks. They used 2 university professors. So watch out to all those university professors. You could be called into historic talks at any moment. But all that to say, then they culminated in this very public signing ceremony. And so while we recognize that the informal secret efforts were critical to getting to the content of the Declaration of Principles, this very public signing ceremony also serves a purpose. And so by looking at these 2 processes together, we can see how we sometimes can use all of our tools to achieve peace You'll see President Clinton there in the middle. Any peace agreement that is set forth in this public way with the U.S. president standing behind it is one that where the parties are saying, yes, we commit publicly to peace and we expect you to hold us accountable. Sometimes that's written into the agreement, sometimes it's not. Many of times in actuality, agreements are not always fully implemented. But this public signing ceremony definitely serves a purpose of using the state levers to bring the parties to agreement and then to hold them to account. So, moving on from Oslo, as I said, I started out my career working in South Sudan for an NGO working on community peace building. We'll get more into that in a minute. But I went on from there to work in a very formal settings, to be, as you'll know from the musical Hamilton, in the room where it happened. So I spent many years in the State Department, and at one point in rooms that look a little bit like this with wood-paneled walls and sort of historic building. Then I went on to work at the White House with the marble corridors, so very formal settings. Although for me, working on African peace processes, the room where it happens was often a hotel conference room with no windows, kind of locked in there for hours on end while the parties were negotiating. But that was definitely where I wanted to be, and it was a really wonderful part of my career. But as I said, I left government a little over a year and a half ago. And since then, I left and I've been looking at ways that we can bring these informal, citizen-led peace processes together with formal peace processes and look at how they can complement each other. So one way to look at this, these two categories, is to look at this list of Nobel Peace Prize winners. I just chose to go back to 2010, obviously. Could go back much farther than that. But here you'll see what you think of as classic peacemaking actors, the European Union, states, state-led, they got it for their work in the Balkans, but also the years before that, bringing France and Germany together and Eastern and Western Europe. Heads of state, such as Colombian President Santos, who was the architect of the peace deal between the Colombians and the FARC. So you see very formal actors on this list, but what you also see are citizen-led actors, in fact, in an even greater number than the sort of organized formal institutions. And obviously, some of these actors have worked for decades and made incredible impact on peace through their work. So I just wanted to show you that, yes, I'm not arguing that they're not. Yes, citizen peace efforts are very recognized in the world, but I think sometimes when we get wrapped up in the headlines, we've seen this week up at the UNGA meetings, the UN General Assembly meetings in New York City, the headlines are dominated by world leaders talking about peace, which is wonderful. Nobel would have been very happy to know that his Peace Prize has inspired a lot of action and interest in working towards peace. But I think sometimes we forget to look behind those headlines at the everyday work that citizens do. And I know that many of you have spent time traveling around to different countries, learning languages, building ties, and so that you're very familiar with the work of citizens in building peace. So to get on with that topic, I think there's a few things that make citizen peace building somewhat unique and why it can be so powerful. One are the motivations. I've worked with some very accomplished citizen peace builders, and it always comes home to me that they'll tell you that they can't not be working on the subject they're working on. I had a boss who worked on the campaign to ban landmines, one of the Nobel recipients. And for him, this was a very personal motivation that stretched the length of his career, really most of his life. And so he was going to be working on the effort to ban landmines no matter what job he was in and no matter what phase of life he was in. So these are long, enduring efforts that are deeply personal, often to the people who are working on them. That can be true for world leaders, but it's not always true. Mediators, like U.S. presidents, tend to get moved around between a lot of priorities, and so they'll shift from one to another. But citizen efforts are often much more focused and long-term. They are often close to the problem, particularly if they're representing a community, which allows them to, I think, be a little more creative in finding solutions and finding common ground. I'll get into that, one of those examples in a minute. In timing, they're often working on peace before anyone thinks it's possible. Again, I have another example of that we'll get into. And I think even more important, they work on peace long after everyone else has declared the peace process signed and the deal done. But it's really in the implementation and it's citizens' work to implement that deal that I think determines whether it ultimately is successful or not. They're often focused on process. For them, the process is the success, not always looking at the final outcome per se. So all of this means that their efforts tend to be quite durable, and they're willing to, suffer the ups and downs and still persist where they are able to. Again, we'll get into an example in a minute, but they're very able to shape and actually very essential in shaping public opinion, which is very important as to whether the peace process ultimately gets implemented or not. So that means that anyone who's working on a formal process, it behooves them and for the sake of the formal peace process to look to citizens at ways that they can help them become voices for the success of that process. And then obviously the lecture series this time around is called The Future of Citizenship. So I wanted to spend a minute. I'm also a policy planner, which means I like to look at future trends and some data from time to time. And I think one reason why this subject is so important at this time is that it is clear that the number of conflicts in the world is increasing by huge numbers. We have seen that there are 3 times more wars now than there were in 2007. And as these wars are happening, they're becoming more deadly. We're at a 28-year high in the number of deaths annually, which is higher than even at the end of the Cold War, or any time since the end of the Cold War. At the same time, while we're seeing more conflict and more deadly conflict, we're also seeing the institutions that we as global citizens built to deal with these conflicts come under either attack or critique or lose their funding. So this is going back to New York and the General Assembly meetings that are happening there. This is a statue outside of the UN. I was up there a few months ago and saw the statue in person, which I always find incredibly inspiring. It's a statue clearly talking about the UN's role with the flags lined up behind it to silence the guns, as African leaders have said, to end violent conflict around the world. And clearly the UN has never been perfect in achieving this goal, but certainly now is that one of its hardest times, the Cold War, also a very difficult time because the Security Council members do not always see eye to eye. And one example of this is Libya. At a critical time in its peace process was without a UN special representative because the U.S. and Russia could not agree on who that individual should be. So for 2 years, they were without a special representative. So the UN will go through to periods of where it's less able to be effective. We've seen, you'll all be very familiar, USAID did a lot of development work that was peace building and actually had quite a bit of peace building expertise, has had its funding cut and been dismantled. Within the State Department, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where I started my career, has now been disabled just in the past few weeks. The Wilson Center had a Cold War archive that was an amazing source for scholars and researchers looking at the lessons of the Cold War. It is no longer open to the public. And USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, is, and we'll get into it a little bit minute more, but certainly not able to pursue the mandate that it was given at the moment. So all to say, I think this is part of a global trend of attacks on institutions. We will see whether there is a kind of resistance to those attacks and citizens standing up for these institutions that were created. But in any case, I think the work that citizens do to build peace will continue outside even some of these organizations. But I think it will have to be very conscious. And as the sort of formal operations outside states are less able to carry out, we're going to need to rely more and more on citizens to do this work. So clearly, I'm going to get into some examples here now to bring some of these themes to life. But this is a huge field, and so I just wanted to set out that I'm not here to cover all of the academic literature on peace building. Civil resistance is used, nonviolent resistance is used in the U.S. Civil rights movement has its own. I'm sure you can take courses here on it. It has its own literature of its own that I won't get into. But I did want to pull some examples from my work, from people I've worked with, that will help sort of lay out some of these citizen-led peace efforts and how they work and what they can accomplish. As a peace practitioner, a conflict practitioner, I can't leave without giving you a little bit of theory. You're probably familiar with this. It's called the conflict curve. On the bottom, you have the axis over time. And the vertical axis is intensity, going anything from peace to war. And so we talk about the first part of the curve as conflict prevention. How do we prevent conflict, which exists among us all the time, from turning violent? Crisis management, once that conflict turns violent, this is where peace processes fit in. How do you de-escalate it? And then peace building or post-conflict work, how do you kind of pick up the ties of conflicts that happen so that conflicts don't reoccur? And so we often, I think, are familiar with the state-led efforts at each of these moments in time deterrence is a key, military deterrence is a key conflict prevention effort. We've seen recently as Russia aircraft have entered into, Estonian airspace, NATO scrambled jets to say, no, you can't come any farther, return back, and the Russians did in this instance. Another state organ for conflict prevention and formal track one negotiations are big summits. This happened last summer in Switzerland, inviting world leaders to talk about Russia-Ukraine. More recently, President Putin and President Trump talking about Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is in Alaska. And the UN's peacekeeping efforts definitely fit in the spectrum of formal state-building efforts. Of course, there are many, many more examples. But what I wanted to say is that also at each stages of the conflict curve, you have citizen-led processes working on these efforts. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they're wholly separate. One that many of you may be familiar with is in sort of the classic people-to-people trust building, the idea that if you bring people from different communities together in person, they will see the humanity and build bridges across communities. Seeds of Peace is just one of the most well-known in that space. This is an image of one of my favorite examples from the Liberian Civil War. This is a group of both Christian and Muslim women who came together. They were not part of the formal process. In fact, they were not allowed in the formal process, but they started quite a long-standing movement. They prayed together. They staged peaceful protests around the presidential palace. And then when the track one, the formal negotiations happened in Monrovia, they traveled there. They were not allowed in, but they formed a blockade, an arm-in-arm blockade around the process and wouldn't let the leaders who were negotiating leave until they had agreed to a peace deal. They had said, our society has had enough with conflict. You all need to get on this. So that's one very good example of how a citizen-led peace movement can influence a formal track one process. We have national dialogues in which citizens come together and try to build peaceful solutions instead of going to war with each other. And then this is an example from Rwanda of an informal truth-telling. It's called the Gacaca courts, where citizens came together to talk about what had happened to them with no accountability or punishment ascribed to it. So you are very familiar with the formal tribunals. This is an example. Rwanda had both, actually, but a lot of power given to this sort of community-to-community peace-building type conversation. So these, there are powerful tools both at the state level and at the citizen level. Getting into some of my more of cases that I've experienced more personally, I'll go through four examples. This is from South Sudan, where, as I said, I worked for an NGO on peace building. This was in the summer of 2007, so it was after the 22-year Sudanese civil war ended and before the referendum where the South Sudanese voted to create their own country. And I was in Juba, so what would then become South Sudan, and there were guns everywhere. The South Sudanese had been armed and to fight the Sudanese in the civil war, and so even people very young, what were called cattle camp youth, who protected the cattle, the cows, which was really a store of wealth for these communities, a lot of them had guns. And so what used to be a common practice of cattle raiding without guns had now become a very violent practice where guns were used as these communities tried to raid each other's cattle. And the community said, this is enough. We need to remove these guns or get some better handle on this situation. And the UN was there to try to help them. But the UN didn't have enough resources to disarm all of these communities at the same time, which would have been ideal. So instead, they were disarming one community and then going to the next one. But as you can imagine, when one community found out that their rival had been disarmed, they would then stage an attack on them and steal their cattle. So the community leaders got together and said, we need to figure this out. And they came up with a solution that the UN had not come up with, which was that they could collect the guns from the community leader could, and put them in a communal warehouse, and the community leader had the key. So the guns were accessible to the communities, but only if the community leader decided that they needed to access them. So this was a bit of a deterrent to the rival communities. So it was a good example to me that citizens can generate creative solutions. As I said, they're often closer to the problem, and they are very motivated to find pathways to peace that when sometimes in formal institutions, like even the UN with all of its resources, is not able to. later in my career, at this point, I was working for the State Department, and this was taken in Burma, Myanmar. I had an incredible job where I got to travel around to all of the outlying states in I'll call it Burma. You can call it either, and kind of investigate what was happening at the time. And these ethnic groups had been both fighting each other and fighting the military government. I was there at a time of democratic opening, where there was an elected government. And these ethnic groups were trying to figure out how to create ceasefires and peace processes in a way that they could all work together. So this is a photo I took, and it's depicting a parable that they have, which is that one twig is easily broken, but all the twigs together is very hard to break. And they knew that if they each negotiated separate ceasefires with the military, they would all be different and they would be kind of used against each other, and they would all end up with different timing and that. So they were trying to work together to negotiate a common ceasefire and to work to rewrite the Constitution. This is actually, unfortunately, I've given you a lot of positive examples. This for me is actually the opposite, a negative example of how things can go wrong, and then looking into the future, what we can do better. No, I don't ascribe any particular blame in this case, but it is sort of a classic construct that, of course, in a peaceful Myanmar and a democratic Myanmar, it was the military who had previously run the country that had the most to lose. Everyone knew this. It wasn't, it's not new information, but so this question of if you know you're going to have a spoiler in a peace process, how do you deal with that? And I think one really important element in dealing with that is engaging the citizenry and engaging citizens who want to work for peace. This is very relevant to the Russia-Ukraine case now. Should the Ukrainians sign a formal ceasefire or even a bigger political deal, I suspect that they will be they will have to encounter some of these efforts to denigrate a peace process and spoilers who will want to overturn that. I'll give you 3 risks and then some ways to mitigate them. And when I've looked at this issue, one of the big risks, as I've already mentioned, is an internal spoiler. So in this case, it was the Burmese military, someone who stands a lot to lose from the peace talks and wants to undermine them. Sometimes you have an external spoiler or someone working to kind of put a wrench in the system through propaganda campaigns or disinformation, other ways, again, of undermining the negotiation process. Sometimes they spread false information about what's being negotiated, or sometimes they just exacerbate and lift up the existing internal narratives that are against it. And then the third risk, as I said, are existing internal tensions that are very common. So once a peace process is signed, you often get kind of a fraying of the society that had come together around the peace process. If you're on the front lines, maybe you're just relieved to have the fighting done and you're willing to compromise a little more for that. If you're a diaspora member outside the community, often you are much more willing to hold out and wait and really have higher expectations of certain elements being put into the agreement. So you may have this split across society that can be, as I said before, external actors can tap into. So there are mitigation measures, and citizens are often central to these. One is the content of the agreement, and this is more on the negotiators, but, and I think President Zelensky already does have a very good sense of what the population is looking for in agreement. With Ukraine, it's definitely some form of security guarantee so that they don't feel like an invasion will come again immediately into their country. So it's essential that the agreement that's achieved includes that. But then these rest are a lot more citizen-based, so you need to build a support base. Validators are incredibly important to this, and it can be anything from, in the U.S., Hollywood films can often lift up the story and build popular support for a movement or an institution. But basically, it's any kind of group of citizens who are willing to speak up for an agreement when you know that others will speak up against it. And there are also formal mechanisms to use this. The population is often asked if they support an agreement through a referendum. Some have succeeded, some have failed, and then been retried and succeeded in the end. But a referendum is a great way to say the population is behind this and build popular support for it. Parliamentary or congressional approval is another way to say, look, there's a broad swath of people who support this agreement. And then even information campaigns to try to get out information as to what actually is in the agreement. Spoiler management, going back to the Burmese military, I think no amount of like information about why peace was beneficial would have changed that dynamic. So at some point in time, you try to peel off the sort of fence sitters and get them to support the deal, but at some point, you need a plan to deal with those who aren't going to support the deal, particularly if they actively try to undermine it. Number 4, proactive communication. Kofi Annan, when he was mediating a negotiation in Kenya between Kenyan leaders, would go out every night at the end of negotiations and brief the population on what had been discussed that day. So they were sort of following along the talks. Now, I talked about the Oslo secret negotiations. In that case, it's very difficult to bring what I call bringing the population along with you. It's very difficult because the population doesn't know the talks are happening. That's the value of secret talks, is that they're happening behind closed doors. So then in that case, you just very quickly, when the agreement is made public, need to get out there and have a plan and have a campaign where you're explaining what the agreement is, why it's necessary, and again, getting those validators behind you. And then a counter disinformation campaign. You know that there will be people trying to undermine the agreement, particularly with false information, and so then just being prepared to counter that when it comes in. So that I take away from the Burma case, and I think is very relevant to the Ukraine case going forward. Now, moving on to the last part of the conflict curve, on the conflict reconciliation part, U.S.-Vietnam relations are sort of a fascinating case study into this, and the work between the formal and the informal. And the lesson here for me was that citizens can fill a gap when the formal processes are completely absent. This is a picture of Secretary Blinken meeting his Vietnamese counterpart. But it was 20 years after the U.S. left Vietnam militarily in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords. It was 20 years until U.S. and Vietnam restored diplomatic relations, again, a formal mechanism for talking to each other. But in that span of time, citizens were going back and forth, having conversations, negotiations around the issues that mattered to them. Again, coming back to this issue of that citizens often work very intensely on the issues that are consequential to them. Some of those issues included prisoners of war and the missing soldiers after the war, landmine removal, and the dealing with the effects of Agent Orange. And these are not non-controversial topics. In fact, at the beginning, citizens were sort of talking past each other or having very controversial conversations. Apparently the Americans thought that the Vietnamese were withholding information from them about those missing in action and where they might be. But over time, with the kind of determined citizen efforts and negotiations, eventually by 1986, Vietnam opened up its country to Americans to come in and hold surveys and look for the missing throughout the country. And in these efforts, eventually it created space for bipartisan congressional effort to both fund some of these efforts and to make physical trips and to create policies that wouldn't have been possible without the momentum created by citizen peace-building efforts. This, I think, is a very powerful image of 4 U.S. Vietnam vets returning to Vietnam, and this is a helmet from a North Vietnamese soldier that one of the vets had held for 40 years, for more than 40 years, and he's taking it back to the soldier's family in an act of reconciliation. And so for me, this is a report that my two colleagues who work intensely on this at the U.S. Institute of Peace, that I highly recommend to you all, but it's a report they produced on looking at the restoration of ties between countries after conflicts. They looked at both France and German reparations or restoration of ties, and U.S. and Japan restoring ties after World War II. And they looked particularly at the citizens' role in that. And I'll just give you quickly a few lessons before moving on to my last example. And one is that, as I've already said, citizens can bridge a gap when there isn't a formal process. Citizens in informal roles can step in, often on essential issues that are critical to them. We saw that in this case with particularly the missing soldiers. There's both horizontal and vertical reconciliation. This is a very strong example of horizontal reconciliation between societies. You also need citizens to work on reconciliation with their governments, as has happened in both the U.S. and Vietnam since the war. And a very interesting diplomatic example was that the U.S. and Vietnam finally ended up in a construct of acknowledging the past but really focus on looking towards the future. At first, relations were really stymied by the initial Vietnamese demand for an apology. And when they dropped that demand, then it allowed diplomatic relations to really accelerate and come much farther. That isn't the right answer in every case, but it is certainly one example of how to move beyond the past. Building momentum, again, these were disparate actors working on different issues. Some were diaspora groups, businessmen, universities, all interacting with their Vietnamese counterparts. But over time, that created a political space in the U.S. that allowed more formal engagement. And then the last lesson from this case for me is a geopolitical one, that sometimes you need to harness openings as they occur. And for the U.S. and Vietnam, part of their looking forward strategy was centered around the time of China's rise, and both countries really seeing it in their interest to rebuild relations with each other in the face of a common interest there. So my last example today I wanted to leave you with is the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I worked until recently for the past year. And it is one of the best examples I can think of citizen-driven peace campaigns, and in this case, creating a whole new institution. There have been many citizen-driven peace campaigns in the United States. One to ban the use of landmines. You'll remember the hashtag, some of you might remember the hashtag Kony 2012, or Bring Back Our Girls. The latter was a Nigerian girls taken by a terrorist group. But the founding of the U.S. Institute of Peace, I think, really speaks to how very diverse elements in American society can come together and build something, again, involving Congress. You'll see that as a theme here. But the idea for an Academy of Peace actually goes back to George Washington. He thought that America should have an Academy of Peace and an Academy of War. And the Academy of War became West Point University. And it took many, many years later until there was a nationwide campaign in the 60s and 70s of Americans, veterans, again, playing a huge role, religious communities, universities, peace advocates, creating a national movement for peace. It was picked up by Congress and also worked together with Congress, and it was bipartisan effort in Congress. Often, and actually some of the strongest advocates for the U.S. Institute of Peace were veterans from World War II, from the Vietnam War, and the Korean War. And they came together because they believed that the U.S. needed to do more, needed an institute to work to prevent future wars, given that they had seen one of the congressmen had been part of the landing crafts in the Pacific Theater, and then went on to do a survey of Hiroshima and the destruction that was created by the atomic bomb. And so he was motivated by that experience to work very hard. It took them many years to create the U.S. Institute of Peace that was finally signed into law in 1984 by Ronald Reagan as an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And as some of you might be aware, the future of USIP is currently being decided by the courts. The Trump administration claimed that it was an executive branch agency and then took physical control of the building, which was privately funded, and fired nearly all of the employees, including me. And so while I sincerely hope this headquarters building is beautiful, it's, as I said, privately funded, and it sits on the National Mall. And so its doors are open to visitors. We get school groups that come through, veterans groups, anyone's looking for inspiration, lessons, research, and even convening, often working with the formal peacemaking institutions on peace processes. And so while I hope that USIP is able to once again open its doors to all of you who want to come visit Washington, D.C., even if it is not able to, I know that American citizen-led peace building efforts will continue for many years into the future. And as I said, I think they'll become even more important. So whether you are in part of a very formal process, like the picture on the left, or in a much more informal process, I hope that you'll recognize that these two types of processes can work together, and really when they're working in unison can they have the biggest impact. So thanks very much.